Commander David Kane had participated in dozens of first-contact ceremonies throughout his diplomatic career, but nothing had prepared him for the crystalline majesty of the Zephyrian throne room or the electric tension that seemed to permeate every surface of the ancient chamber. The walls themselves appeared to be alive, their translucent surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that responded to the emotional states of those within, creating an environment where deception was nearly impossible to maintain. Queen Seraphina sat upon the throne of eternal light, her regal bearing commanding absolute attention from the assembled court. Her silver hair cascaded over shoulders draped in robes that seemed woven from starlight itself, while her eyes held the ancient wisdom of a species whose civilization predated humanity's first ventures beyond Earth. Beside her, on a smaller throne carved from the same crystalline material, sat Princess Lyralii. A child of perhaps 6 years whose delicate features carried an ethereal beauty that marked her as heir to one of the galaxy's oldest royal bloodlines. Commander Kane, Queen Seraphina's voice carried harmonics that made the chamber's walls shimmer in response. The Zephyrian Empire welcomes you and your delegation. We trust that our discussions regarding expanded trade agreements will prove beneficial to both our peoples. David stepped forward with the practiced precision of someone trained in diplomatic protocol, his dress uniform bearing the insignia of the Human Colonial Alliance's Cultural Exchange Division. Your Majesty, it is an honor to represent humanity in these negotiations. The Alliance values the opportunity to strengthen our relationship with the Zephyrian Empire. The formal exchange proceeded exactly as rehearsed, with David presenting ceremonial gifts and Queen Seraphina responding with gracious acceptance that maintained the careful balance of mutual respect between sovereign powers. But as David completed his introductory remarks and prepared to transition into technical discussions, something unexpected happened. Princess Lyralii looked directly at him for the first time since the ceremony began. The child's reaction was immediate and devastating. Her face crumpled into an expression of recognition so profound that it seemed to physically wound her, and she began crying with the heartbroken sobs of someone confronting an impossible truth. These weren't the tears of a spoiled royal child having a tantrum, they were the desperate, anguished cries of profound emotional recognition. "Papa," she screamed in ancient Zephyrian, the word carrying harmonics that made every crystal surface in the throne room resonate with sympathetic vibrations. "Papa came back. Papa came back." The throne room fell silent except for the child's sobs as every courtier, guard, and diplomatic observer struggled to process what they were witnessing. Princess Lyralii, heir to an empire that traced its lineage back over 3 millennia, was calling a human stranger, father, in their most sacred language. David felt his diplomatic training collide with pure human instinct as the child's distress triggered every protective response he'd developed during his military career. But before he could formulate an appropriate reaction, Princess Lyralii did something that shattered every protocol in the chamber. She ran to him. The 6-year-old princess abandoned her throne, ignored her mother's sharp command to remain in position, pushed past the ceremonial guards whose duty was to protect her, and threw herself directly at David's legs with the desperate urgency of someone who had been waiting years for this moment. "You came back," she sobbed against his uniform, her small arms wrapping around his knees with surprising strength. "I waited and waited like Mama said, but you came back." David looked down at the child clinging to him, this little girl whose tears were soaking through his dress uniform while she spoke words that made no logical sense, and felt something shift in his understanding of why he'd been specifically requested for this diplomatic mission. Through the silence, Queen Seraphina's voice carried a quality David had never heard in his years of diplomatic service, the sound of absolute terror barely controlled by royal training. "Lyralii," the queen said, her harmonics causing the chamber walls to pulse with urgent patterns, "return to your throne immediately. Commander Kane is our honored guest, not Papa." Princess Lyralii interrupted, looking up at David with eyes that held intelligence far beyond her apparent age. "But he has Papa's face. He has Papa's voice. He has Papa's kind heart that I can feel through the crystal song." David's mind raced through possibilities as he tried to understand what could cause such a reaction from a child who should have no connection to humanity beyond formal diplomatic relations. The princess's reference to Papa's face and Papa's voice suggested recognition of specific features rather than general human characteristics. Queen Seraphina rose from her throne, her movements carrying the controlled desperation of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. The bioluminescent patterns in her robes shifted from royal silver to deep purples and blues that David's cultural briefings had identified as colors associated with fear and grief. "Commander Kane," Queen Seraphina said, her voice now carrying undertones that suggested private communication was urgently needed. "Perhaps we should continue our discussions in a more private setting." Princess Lyralii is clearly overwhelmed by the excitement of meeting representatives from Earth. But Princess Lyralii only clung tighter to David's legs, her sobs gradually settling into the kind of contented sighs that suggested she had found exactly what she'd been searching for. "Don't let them take me away again," she whispered against his uniform, her words barely audible but carrying desperate urgency. "Please don't leave me again, Papa. I've been so good, just like you said I should be." David looked from the child in his arms to Queen Seraphina, whose royal composure was visibly cracking under the weight of whatever truth Princess Lyralii's reaction had revealed. The assembled court watched in stunned silence as their absolute monarch struggled with emotions that made the chamber's crystalline walls pulse with chaotic patterns. "Your Majesty," David said carefully, his diplomatic training warring with growing realization that this ceremony had revealed something far more complex than trade negotiations, "I believe we do need to speak privately." Queen Seraphina's eyes met his across the throne room, and in that moment, David saw the weight of secrets that could topple empires, the burden of choices made in love and desperation, and the terror of a mother whose carefully guarded truth was about to destroy everything she'd built to protect her child. "Yes," Queen Seraphina said, her voice breaking with barely controlled emotion as she watched her daughter find comfort in the arms of a man whose presence confirmed her worst fears, "I believe we do." As the throne room slowly emptied of courtiers and guards, Princess Lyralii remained attached to David's side, her small hand gripping his with the determination of someone who had finally found what had been missing from her world. "Papa," she whispered with the absolute certainty of a child who knew her own truth regardless of what adults might claim, "I knew you'd come back to me." And in that moment, David understood that his diplomatic mission had just become something far more personal and infinitely more complicated than any trade agreement could ever be. The private chambers of Queen Seraphina were a sanctuary of crystalline beauty where light seemed to exist as a living entity, flowing through walls and ceiling in patterns that responded to the emotional states of those within. As the doors sealed behind them, David found himself alone with the most powerful ruler in this sector of the galaxy, while Princess Lyralii remained pressed against his side with the unwavering determination of someone who had finally found what she'd been seeking. "Commander Kane," Queen Seraphina said, her royal composure finally beginning to crack as she watched her daughter's obvious attachment to a human stranger, "I believe we need to discuss why my daughter recognizes you." David felt the weight of implications he didn't fully understand settling on his shoulders like tactical armor. "Your Majesty, I've never been to Zephyria before this mission. I've had no contact with your daughter or your court prior to today's ceremony." "No," Seraphina said quietly, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's walls pulse with colors David was learning to associate with profound sadness, "but your brother has." The words hit David like a kinetic weapon, reframing everything about Princess Lyralii's reaction and the terror he'd seen in Queen Seraphina's eyes. "My brother Thomas. But he was killed in action during a deep space reconnaissance mission 3 years ago." 7 years ago, Seraphina corrected, settling into a chair that seemed carved from living crystal while her daughter continued to cling to David's hand. Lieutenant Thomas Kane was part of a diplomatic cultural exchange mission to Zephyria. He was remarkable. Intelligent, kind, genuinely curious about our people rather than simply tolerating us for political advantage. David felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place as he recalled the classified mission reports he'd never been allowed to read completely. The reconnaissance mission that killed him, it was actually diplomatic assignment to your world. The reconnaissance mission where he was reported killed was real, Seraphina said, her bioluminescent robes shifting through colors that spoke of old grief. But Thomas Kane didn't die in space combat, Commander. He died in a transport accident while returning to Earth after completing his diplomatic assignment here. Princess Lyralii looked up at David with eyes that held intelligence far beyond her apparent age. "Mama has Papa's picture in her special room," she said with the matter-of-fact tone of a child revealing secrets adults thought were hidden. "She talks to it when she thinks I'm sleeping, and she cries sometimes." The implications of what Queen Seraphina was revealing began to cascade through David's understanding like a tactical analysis revealing enemy positions. "Your Majesty, are you telling me that my brother had a personal relationship with you during his diplomatic mission?" "Your brother," Seraphina said, rising from her chair and moving to a crystalline cabinet that opened at her touch, "was the first person in my life who saw me as Seraphina rather than as Queen of the Zephyrian Empire." She withdrew a holographic image generator, activating it to display a three-dimensional recording that made David's breath catch in his throat. The hologram showed Thomas Kane, unmistakably his older brother, sitting in what appeared to be a garden setting with Queen Seraphina. But instead of formal diplomatic positioning, they were relaxed, laughing together with the easy intimacy of people genuinely comfortable with each other. "He stayed for 4 months, Seraphina continued, her voice carrying the weight of memories that had shaped every decision she'd made since. What began as cultural exchange became more. Thomas was fascinated by our biocrystalline technology, our social structures, our art. And I was fascinated by someone who treated me as if my thoughts mattered more than my political authority." Princess Lyralii moved closer to the hologram, her small hand reaching toward the image of a man whose features were unmistakably similar to David's. "That's my papa," she said with absolute certainty. "He used to sing human songs and tell me stories about stars that don't have crystal songs." David stared at his niece, because the truth was becoming impossible to deny, and felt his understanding of his brother's death, his own diplomatic assignment, and the little girl who had recognized him reshaping everything he thought he knew. "Princess Lyralii is Thomas's daughter," David said, the words feeling surreal even as he spoke them. "Princess Lyralii is the heir to the Zephyrian Empire whose legitimacy depends on her bloodline being accepted as purely royal," Seraphina replied, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden alone. "Commander, do you understand what would happen if my people discovered that their future queen is half-human?" David's military training kicked in as he calculated the political implications. Civil war. The traditional factions would never accept a hybrid heir, regardless of her abilities or your authority as her mother. "Exactly," Seraphina said, deactivating the hologram and returning to her chair with movements that spoke of years of careful control. "So I told my people that Lyralii was the product of advanced genetic enhancement, a new evolution of royal bloodlines designed to strengthen our species' future. The lie has protected her for 6 years." Princess Lyralii looked between her mother and David with the expression of someone finally understanding conversations she'd overheard but never comprehended. "Mama, is that why I'm different from the other royal children? Is that why I can hear thoughts from human minds and Zephyrian crystal songs at the same time?" "Yes, little star," Seraphina said, her voice breaking with the emotion of finally being honest with her daughter. "You're different because you're special in ways that no one else in our empire has ever been." David knelt to Princess Lyralii's level, studying features that now clearly showed the blend of human and Zephyrian characteristics, his brother's eyes and bone structure combined with Seraphina's ethereal coloring and the subtle luminescence that marked royal Zephyrian bloodlines. "Lyralii," he said gently, using her name for the first time, "I'm your father's brother. That makes me your uncle. Your papa, he never knew about you. He died before your mother could tell him he was going to have a daughter." The child's face crumpled with an expression of loss so profound that it made the chamber's crystalline walls pulse with sympathetic resonance. "Papa didn't leave on purpose. He didn't choose to go away. He would never have chosen to leave you," David said, his voice carrying absolute conviction based on everything he'd known about his brother's character. "Thomas loved children, and he would have loved you more than anything in the universe." Queen Seraphina watched the interaction between her daughter and David with expressions that cycled through relief, terror, and something that might have been hope. "Commander Kane," she said finally, now you understand why your presence here is so dangerous. Lyraliai's recognition of your resemblance to Thomas could expose everything I've done to protect her inheritance and our empire's stability. David looked at this remarkable woman who had carried the burden of protecting both her daughter and her people through years of deception, and at his niece whose hybrid abilities were already beginning to manifest in ways that would eventually be impossible to hide. Your Majesty, he said, I think we need to discuss whether protecting Lyraliai's secret is still possible, or whether it's time to find a better way to protect her future. Princess Lyraliai moved between them, taking both David's hand and her mother's, her touch causing gentle waves of bioluminescence to flow through the chamber's crystalline surfaces. I don't want to be a secret anymore, she said with the clarity of a child who understood more than adults realized. I want to know about Papa's people and Mama's people, and I want everyone to know that being different isn't something to hide. As the three of them stood connected in the chamber where truth was finally being spoken, David realized that his diplomatic mission had become something far more important, helping his brother's daughter discover who she really was, and helping the woman Thomas had loved find a way to honor both truth and duty in a galaxy that would challenge every choice they made. The revelation of Princess Lyraliai's true parentage transformed David's diplomatic mission into something far more personal and infinitely more complex. Over the following days, as he worked with Queen Seraphina to manage the political implications while bonding with his newly discovered niece, he began to understand the impossible choices Seraphina had been making every day for 7 years. Uncle David, Princess Lyraliai said during their third private meeting in the Queen's gardens, her small hand wrapped around his as they walked among crystalline flowers that chimed with musical tones when the wind touched them. Why do the court advisors look worried when they see us together? David exchanged glances with Queen Seraphina, who had been carefully monitoring every interaction between her daughter and the human uncle whose resemblance to Thomas Kane was becoming impossible to ignore. They're concerned about protocol, little star. Court advisors worry about many things. But I can hear their thoughts sometimes, Lyraliai said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone whose hybrid abilities were developing beyond what pure Zephyrian genetics should allow. Lord Vortak thinks I'm unnaturally comfortable with human visitors. What does that mean? The question carried implications that made David's diplomatic training clash with his protective instincts. Lord Vortak was the leader of the traditional faction within the Zephyrian court, someone whose political power depended on maintaining strict adherence to ancient bloodline purity laws. It means, Queen Seraphina said carefully, that some people notice when you behave differently than they expect royal children to behave. You mean when I act like I understand human thoughts and feelings better than others Ephirians do? Lyraliai asked, her intelligence cutting straight to the heart of the political problem her existence created. David knelt beside his niece, studying features that were becoming more obviously hybrid as her abilities manifested. Lyraliai, your special talents make you remarkable, but they also make some people nervous about things they don't understand. Like how I can make the crystal garden sing in harmony with human music, she asked, gesturing toward the flowering formations that had begun responding to melodies David had been humming unconsciously. Exactly like that, Seraphina said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been watching her daughter's abilities develop beyond what their carefully constructed lies could explain. Lyraliai, your gifts are beautiful, but they're also unusual for someone of pure Zephyrian heritage. Over the past week, David had witnessed demonstrations of his niece's hybrid capabilities that were both amazing and terrifying in their implications. She could communicate telepathically with both human and Zephyrian minds, interface with crystalline technology in ways that exceeded what trained engineers could accomplish, and sense emotional undercurrents with an accuracy that made court intrigue impossible to hide from her. Commander Kane, came a voice from behind them as Lord Vortak approached through the garden paths, his ceremonial robes displaying patterns that David's cultural briefings had identified as formal challenge colors. I trust you're finding Princess Lyraliai to be a fascinating study in royal Zephyrian capabilities. The emphasis on study and the calculating way Vortak observed their interactions made David realize that the political crisis Seraphina had feared was beginning to materialize. Princess Lyraliai is remarkably intelligent, David replied diplomatically, while noting how his niece had instinctively moved closer to him when Vortak appeared. Her understanding of both cultures could prove valuable for future human-Zephyrian cooperation. Indeed, Vortak said, his attention focusing on the way Princess Lyralia had positioned herself between David and her mother with protective instincts that seemed beyond her age. Your Majesty, I've been reviewing historical records of genetic enhancement programs, and I find myself curious about the specific techniques used to create such comprehensive abilities in our young princess. The question was a direct challenge disguised as academic interest, and David could see Queen Seraphina's composure beginning to show strain under Vortak's scrutiny. The enhancement protocols are classified for security reasons, Seraphina replied, her voice carrying royal authority that brooked no further questions. Of course, Vortak said, but his expression suggested he was far from satisfied with that explanation. Though I confess curiosity about why genetic enhancements would include such remarkable affinity for human psychological patterns. Princess Lyralia looked up at David with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what was happening even if the adults thought they were being subtle about it. Lord Vortak doesn't believe Mama's story about genetic enhancement, she said with devastating directness. He thinks there's something different about my heritage that Mama doesn't want him to know. The silence that followed her observation was filled with the musical chiming of crystal flowers responding to emotional tension in the air. Vortak's eyes sharpened with the expression of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed by an unexpected source. Princess Lyralia, Vortak said carefully, what makes you believe I doubt the official records of your origins? Because I can hear what you're really thinking when you look at me, Lyralia replied with the fearless honesty of a child who hadn't learned to be afraid of political consequences. You think I'm too different to be pure Zephyrian, and you're wondering if that makes me unfit to inherit Mama's throne. David felt crisis crystallizing around them as his niece's psychic sensitivity exposed the political threat that Queen Seraphina had been desperately trying to manage through careful deception. Your Majesty, Vortak said, his voice carrying new authority as he realized the child had essentially admitted that the official story of her genetics was incomplete, I believe formal investigation into Princess Lyralia's heritage may be necessary to confirm her eligibility for succession. That won't be necessary, Seraphina said, her voice carrying the absolute command of someone whose authority was being directly challenged. I'm afraid it will, Vortak replied, his political instincts recognizing an opportunity to destabilize the current power structure. The traditional council has the right to verify royal bloodlines, particularly when questions arise about unusual characteristics in potential heirs. Princess Lyralia moved closer to David, her small hand finding his with the certainty of someone seeking protection from family rather than strangers. Uncle David, she said quietly, using the title that made Vortak's eyes widen with sudden understanding, will you help Mama explain to Lord Vortak that being different doesn't make me broken? The slip, calling David uncle in front of the one person whose suspicions could destroy everything, crystallized the moment when careful deception became impossible to maintain. Vortak stared between David and Princess Lyralia, his political mind obviously processing implications that reframed everything about the child's unusual abilities and obvious comfort with human presence. Uncle, Vortak repeated slowly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just discovered information that could topple governments. Princess Lyralia, did you just call Commander Kane your uncle? David looked at Queen Seraphina, whose expression carried the resigned terror of someone whose carefully constructed protection had just collapsed, and realized that the moment of choice between continued deception and dangerous truth had arrived whether they were ready for it or not. Yes, Princess Lyralia said with the absolute honesty that made political subterfuge impossible, Uncle David is Papa's brother, which makes him my family. Isn't that what uncles are? In the silence that followed, David could almost hear the sound of an empire's political foundations shifting as Lord Vortak processed the implications of what the child had just revealed about her true heritage and the identity of her father. The revelation of Princess Lyraliai's parentage sent shockwaves through the Zephyrian court that threatened to tear the empire apart. Within hours of Lord Vorthak's discovery, emergency sessions of the Traditional Council were convened, political factions began choosing sides, and Queen Seraphina found herself fighting for both her daughter's inheritance and the stability of her realm. "Your Majesty," Lord Vorthak announced during the formal council session, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed he held the political advantage, "the evidence suggests that Princess Lyraliai's father was the human Lieutenant Thomas Kane, making her a hybrid who cannot legitimately inherit the throne according to our ancient bloodline laws." David sat in the observers section, his diplomatic status allowing him to witness the political battle that would determine his niece's future. Queen Seraphina stood before the assembled nobility with regal composure that masked the terror he could see in her eyes. "Princess Lyraliai's genetic enhancement represents the evolution of royal bloodlines," Seraphina replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's crystalline walls pulse with authority. "Her abilities exceed those of any pure Zephyrian heir in our recorded history." "Abilities that she inherited from alien genetics," Vorthak countered, his political instincts recognizing the moment to press his advantage. "Your Majesty, however remarkable the child's capabilities, the law requires pure Zephyrian bloodlines for legitimate succession." David watched the council members' reactions, noting how the traditional faction rallied behind Vorthak while the progressive nobles seemed torn between loyalty to their queen and concern about the legal implications of hybrid inheritance. "The law," came a small voice from the chamber entrance, "says that legitimate heirs must prove their worth through wisdom, strength, and service to our people." Princess Lyraliai entered the council chamber with the determined stride of someone who had decided to take control of her own fate. She wore formal court robes that seemed designed for someone much older, her small frame carrying herself with dignity that made every person in the room stop to listen. "Princess Lyraliai," Queen Seraphina said, her voice tight with fear as she realized her daughter was about to step into political waters that could destroy them both, "this is not a place for children. This is exactly the place for the person you're all talking about," Lyraliai replied, moving to the center of the chamber with the confidence of someone who had inherited royal bearing from her mother and tactical courage from her father's bloodline. "Lord Vorthak says I can't inherit the throne because my father was human. I want to know why that makes me less worthy than someone whose abilities are weaker than mine." The directness of her challenge sent ripples of shock through the assembled nobility. David felt his chest swell with pride as he watched his 6-year-old niece confront political opponents with the same fearless honesty that had characterized his brother Thomas. "Princess," Vorthak said carefully, his political instincts recognizing the danger of appearing to bully a child in front of the assembled court, "the question isn't about your personal worthiness, but about legal precedent and traditional law." "Then let's talk about legal precedent," Lyraliai said, her voice carrying harmonics that proved her hybrid nature allowed her to interface with the chamber's crystalline architecture in ways that pure Zephyrians couldn't achieve. "The law says heirs must demonstrate superior abilities that benefit our people. Should I show you what my heritage allows me to accomplish?" Before anyone could stop her, Princess Lyraliai placed her hands on the chamber's central crystal formation, her hybrid abilities interfacing with the ancient technology in ways that made the entire room resonate with harmonious energy. The walls came alive with bioluminescent patterns that displayed real-time data about the Empire's status, resource distributions, communication networks, defensive systems, all accessible to her through genetic capabilities that exceeded anything in Zephyrian history. "I can interface with every crystal network in our Empire simultaneously," she announced, her small voice now amplified through the chamber's acoustic systems. "I can communicate with human minds and Zephyrian consciousness at the same time. I can access technological systems that have been dormant since our ancestors first built them. Are these the abilities of someone unfit to rule?" The demonstration was stunning, but David could see that it was also politically dangerous. Lyraliai's hybrid capabilities were so far beyond normal Zephyrian abilities that they highlighted rather than minimized her alien heritage. "Remarkable abilities," Vorthak acknowledged, but his tone suggested he was turning the demonstration to his advantage, that come from contamination of pure bloodlines. "Princess, your talents prove that human genetics have altered what it means to be Zephyrian." "Good," Lyraliai said simply, her response catching every person in the chamber off guard. Maybe being purely Zephyrian isn't enough anymore. Maybe our people need leaders who can understand more than one way of thinking. Queen Seraphina stepped forward, her maternal instincts warring with political necessity as she watched her daughter defend herself with arguments that could either save or doom them both. Princess Lyralii speaks truth that we must consider carefully, Seraphina said, her voice carrying the authority of someone making a calculated political gamble. Perhaps our empire's future lies not in preserving ancient bloodlines, but in embracing evolution that strengthens our capabilities. Evolution through contamination, Vorthak replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who believed traditional law supported his position. Your Majesty, if we accept hybrid inheritance, we abandon millennia of legal precedent that has maintained our empire's stability. And if we reject evolution, Princess Lyralii said, her small voice cutting through the political rhetoric with devastating clarity, we abandon the possibility of becoming something better than we've ever been before. The chamber fell silent as the assembled nobility processed the implications of what they were witnessing, a 6-year-old half-human child defending her right to inherit an empire through arguments that challenged the fundamental assumptions of their civilization. David realized that the political battle had become something larger than succession law. It was a fight about whether the Zephyrian Empire would choose the safety of tradition or the risk of transformation, with his brother's daughter as the living symbol of what that choice meant. Lord Vorthak, Princess Lyralii said, approaching the traditional faction leader with the fearless confidence of someone who had decided that truth was more important than safety, you're afraid that accepting me means accepting change that you can't control. But change is coming whether you accept it or not. The question is whether you'll help guide that change or be swept away by it. In that moment, David watched his 6-year-old niece demonstrate the same combination of tactical brilliance and moral courage that had made his brother a legend, while Queen Seraphina realized that her daughter's hybrid heritage might be exactly what their empire needed to survive the challenges that traditional thinking could never solve. The climactic moment came when Queen Seraphina made the most courageous decision of her reign, rising from her throne not as a monarch defending her power, but as a mother choosing truth over safety for her daughter's future. The assembled nobility watched in stunned silence as their absolute ruler prepared to either save her empire or destroy it through radical honesty. Lord Vorthak, honored counselors, Seraphina said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber's crystalline walls pulse with determined light, you are correct that Princess Lyralii's father was Lieutenant Thomas Kane of the Human Colonial Alliance. But you are wrong to assume that this makes her unworthy of inheritance. The admission sent shockwaves through the assembly, but Seraphina continued with the steady courage of someone who had chosen to stake everything on a single moment of truth. Thomas Kane died serving both our peoples, conducting research that strengthened the alliance between humanity and our empire. His relationship with me was based on genuine respect, intellectual partnership, and the kind of love that transcends the boundaries between species. David watched his brother's reputation being defended by the woman who had loved him, while Princess Lyralii stood beside her mother with the quiet dignity of someone finally hearing the complete truth about her heritage. Princess Lyralii represents more than hybrid genetics, Seraphina continued, her royal authority now focused on reframing her daughter's nature as evolutionary advancement rather than political liability. She embodies the future of interspecies cooperation, the living proof that our peoples can create something greater together than either could achieve alone. Your Majesty, Vorthak interrupted, but his voice carried less certainty as he realized that Seraphina's strategy was transforming potential scandal into visionary leadership, the legal implications. The legal implications, Princess Lyralii said, stepping forward with the fearless confidence she'd inherited from both her parents, are that our empire gets a leader who can understand human innovation and Zephyrian wisdom simultaneously. She moved to the chamber's central crystal formation, her hybrid abilities allowing her to interface with systems that had been dormant for millennia. Under her touch, the ancient technology came alive with displays that showed real-time data from across the galaxy, trade routes, diplomatic communications, technological developments that pure Zephyrian genetics couldn't access. I can coordinate with human strategic networks and Zephyrian crystal song systems at the same time, she announced, her small voice now amplified through the chamber's harmonics. I can negotiate with species that speak in mathematical concepts and those that communicate through emotional resonance. Are these the limitations you want to prevent from strengthening our empire? The demonstration was breathtaking in its implications. David realized that his niece wasn't just defending her right to inherit, she was proving that hybrid leadership could offer capabilities that traditional genetics couldn't provide. Princess Lyraliai's abilities could revolutionize our diplomatic relationships, said Councillor Meridian, one of the progressive faction leaders whose support could tip the political balance. Your Majesty, perhaps we should consider whether bloodline purity matters less than leadership capability. Capability gained through alien contamination, Vorthak replied, but his voice carried less conviction as more council members began recognizing the strategic advantages of hybrid leadership. Capability gained through evolution, Serafina corrected, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had made peace with dangerous truth. Lord Vorthak, our empire faces challenges that traditional thinking cannot solve. Our princess offers approaches that no pure Zephyrian could develop. The political tide was shifting, but David could see that the outcome still balanced on the edge of civil conflict. Then Princess Lyraliai did something that transformed the entire debate. She knelt. The 6-year-old heir to one of the galaxy's most powerful empires knelt before the assembled nobility with the grace of someone offering service rather than demanding authority. Honored counselors, she said, her voice carrying sincerity that made every crystal surface in the chamber resonate with harmony, I don't want to inherit the throne because it's my birthright. I want to earn it by proving that my hybrid heritage makes me better equipped to serve our people's future. The sight of their future queen kneeling in humility rather than standing in defiance broke through political calculations and touched something deeper in the assembled nobility. Rise, princess, Councillor Meridian said, his voice carrying emotion that suggested personal conviction rather than political maneuvering. A leader who offers service before claiming authority has already demonstrated worthiness that bloodlines cannot measure. One by one, other council members began voicing support, their responses shifting from legal objections to recognition of capabilities that exceeded traditional expectations. Your Majesty, Lord Vorthak said finally, his political instincts recognizing that continued opposition would isolate him from the growing consensus, if Princess Lyraliai's hybrid heritage truly offers advantages for our empire's future, perhaps adaptation of our laws should be considered. The concession wasn't complete victory, but it opened the door for compromise that could preserve both tradition and transformation. Then let us establish new precedent, Queen Serafina said, her voice carrying the relief of someone whose gamble had succeeded. Princess Lyraliai will inherit not despite her hybrid heritage, but because it represents our empire's evolution toward greater capabilities. 3 years later, David stood in the observation deck of the joint Human-Zephyrian research station that Princess Lyraliai had helped design, watching his 9-year-old niece coordinate scientific projects that were advancing both civilizations beyond what either could achieve independently. Uncle David, Lyraliai said, approaching him with the confident stride she'd inherited from her father and the graceful bearing she'd learned from her mother, the new diplomatic protocols are working perfectly. Human and Zephyrian teams are collaborating on 12 major projects simultaneously. David looked at his remarkable niece, this little girl who had defended her right to be different and had transformed that difference into strength that served 2 worlds, and felt pride that encompassed both personal affection and recognition of genuine achievement. Any regrets about choosing to fight for your inheritance? He asked. Lyraliai considered the question with the thoughtful intelligence that made her an effective bridge between species. Just one regret. What's that? I regret that it took a political crisis to make everyone understand that being different doesn't mean being wrong, she said, her voice carrying wisdom that exceeded her years. It turns out that the best leaders are often the ones who don't fit traditional expectations. David smiled, seeing his brother Thomas's courage combined with Queen Serafina's wisdom in the young woman who was reshaping what leadership could mean. In that case, he said, I'm grateful for diplomatic missions, family secrets, and little girls who are brave enough to kneel before truth rather than stand behind lies. Around them, the research station hummed with the collaborative energy of two species learning that diversity of heritage could create strength that neither could achieve alone. The child who had cried when she recognized her father's features in a stranger had grown into a leader who proved that love, truth, and courage could transform even the most impossible circumstances into foundations for building bridges between worlds.